everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today is going to be a little bit of a different video, but one that I'm very excited for. So Arrtx actually reached out to me and sent me their acrylic markers to review, and they're also very kindly sponsoring this video, so thank you so much to Arrtx for sending me them and also for being the sponsor of this video. Now these markers are their brush tip acrylic markers in the anime colors, which is the 60B set, and you can find all the links in the description. The set includes 60 colors and they come in this box so they can be stored upright, which is the most ideal position for them. They also come with 2 sets of stickers to label the markers with the color code, which you do have to apply yourself, and it can be a little bit tedious, but I actually found it kind of relaxing. And of course you don't have to do it, but it can be handy for just creating the swatches and finding the color codes. I first just applied these small stickers to the back using tweezers, which makes it a lot easier, and then I also put on the larger ones, but I just cut out most of that since it's not very interesting to watch. Now let's get into the most interesting part, which is the swatches. So these markers have a brush tip, and the sort of special feature is that you don't need to pump the ink or shake the markers before using them, which is what you usually have to do with most acrylic markers that I've seen, and it definitely makes it a lot more convenient and just enjoyable to use them in my opinion. Since they're acrylic pens, the ink is nice and opaque and it dries very quickly with a matte finish, and it's also waterproof afterwards, so they're great for painting on different surfaces like glass, ceramic, or other smooth materials. The colors in the set are really nice and vibrant. There's lots of variety and a great mix of some light and dark tones, so I was super happy with the selection. Some of the markers tend to be a little bit more liquidy than others, but overall I found them to be super juicy and just satisfying to use. Some of the lighter colors in particular can be a little bit less opaque, which I think is to be expected, but you can also build up the colors very easily in layers, and for me this was actually perfect because it meant that I can lighten some of the colors if I layer the white over them, so it really didn't bother me at all personally, but it's just something to note. I also wrote down the color codes for the swatches, and I will also include them in the top left while I'm painting, so you can always just see which colors I'm using. So here's just a little overview of all of the colors. I think they're really pretty, and let's get into the painting. So for this painting I'm going to be using this watercolor sketchbook just because the paper is quite thick and it can handle a little bit more color, and I also just really like the format. And then I used some washi tape to protect the edges of the paper so I don't have to be careful when I paint over them. And then I picked out this scene from Kiki's delivery service because I thought the colors were perfect for the set, and I could also try out a lot of them for this painting. Then I first just lightly sketched out the composition, so just the rough placement of the clouds, the sea, and the foreground, and of course Kiki herself, so that I can go in and define the individual features. For the more defined sketch, I focused mostly on Kiki herself and also some of the foreground elements like the plants that are swaying in the wind, because the rest of the scene is very painterly, so it doesn't have to be as precise. I started off by painting the sky because I wanted to work from background to foreground just because it made the most sense to me. So I first roughly outlined the shapes of the clouds, and I filled in the upper portion of the sky with this very bright blue color. And since the sky transitions into a lighter color towards the bottom, I went in with a light blue and also blended out that harsh line, which worked surprisingly well. So I just layered both colors on top of each other and sort of blended them a bit with my fingertip. Then I just colored in the rest of the sky, and I used an even lighter shade towards the bottom, which ended up looking a bit too saturated, so I layered the white marker on top and blended it again. Then I moved on to the right side and I just went through the same process again, and with the light blue I tried to outline some of the plants so that it would be easier to see them later on. Now at first I wasn't really sure about which colors to use in the clouds, and in the end I went for this grayish sort of lavender shade to first block out the shadow shapes, and then I used a white marker to lighten it so the edges don't look as harsh. And I kind of just ended up going back and forth and layering both of the shades a couple times to create this sort of softer look and make them look a lot more painterly. And of course it's not really possible to create a sort of watercolor or gouache effect, but I was still really happy with how they turned out, and overall I just really enjoyed using these markers. I actually first saw them in a video on TikTok and I wanted to get them for myself, but then they reached out to me and I was super happy to partner up with them and try out these markers. Next I moved on to Kiki, and I first painted her dress, which is a very muted sort of green. So I first went in with a light greenish gray for the parts of her dress which are in the light, and then I used a darker green for the shadows. The dark green was a little bit too dark and saturated, so I layered the lighter shade on top, and it just ended up being the perfect color. Then I used a light pink for her apron, and again a darker version for the parts in the shade. And for some of the parts I left a little bit of white space here and there, so I could still see where the line art would go later on. Now the skin tone was a little bit more difficult, so first I used the lightest beige, and then a darker, more muted pink for the shadows, and then I went over both of them with the white marker to lighten them up a little bit, and then I also went over the dark area with the light beige to make them look a little bit more cohesive. For the hair, I first colored in the whole area with black as a base, and I tried to mimic the hair strokes around the edges, and then I went over all of the parts that are lit up with a dark brown to slightly lighten them, and with the black as a base it makes it a little bit darker, which is exactly what I wanted. Next I used a very bright red for Kiki's bow, and then I filled in the shadow side with a darker version, and then I went over the lighter section of the hair again one more time to make the difference a little bit more obvious, and then I also colored in her radio with the same two red shades. For the landscape in the background, I used multiple green shades that are more on the bluish side, just because things further away usually appear a bit more bluish because of the atmosphere. So I just started by building up a few layers of green. I used some dark green for a few of the distant trees, and then some lighter greens for the fields. And I also mixed some of the colors to get these sort of in-between shades, and I also layered them a lot to create darker and lighter tones. For the ocean, I started with a bright blue as a base, and I filled in the whole area, and then I layered the white marker on top again to lighten it quite a lot. Then I went back in with that blue shade to create some shadows, and I just made some small dots and dashes. And then I also layered on some other blue shades, some more grayish ones and one really deep blue, and I also sort of blended it in between with the white to make it look a little bit more soft. In general, for the background elements, I mostly just focused on the bigger shapes, and I didn't really include any details to make it look more painterly. For the grass in the foreground, I first started on the left side by layering different shades of green, and this time they're more on the yellowish side, so I mixed some very vibrant greens, but also some more muted sort of olive greens, and a bit of turquoise here and there to make it look more interesting and natural. In the reference image, there are some more defined plants in the foreground, which is the parts that are actually animated in the scene, so they're a lot less painterly and they have less shading overall, which I think kind of adds to the charm of the Studio Ghibli style. I just kept on adding more grass as a background and then creating individual plants on top to create that sort of layered look which makes the scenery feel so detailed. I think the nature in Studio Ghibli movies always looks so beautiful. There's a lot of variety and the nature always feels really realistic, but somehow also dreamy at the same time. For the grass, I made sure that it gets a little bit darker towards the bottom edge, so there's a bit of a gradient, and then I also layered on some individual grass blades and leaves on top of each other to make it look a little bit more full. I definitely didn't follow the reference one-to-one, but I did try to include the most prominent plants that I spotted. Before I started on the rest of the plants, I wanted to kind of complete the sky and the background on the right side, so I first just colored in around some of the silhouettes of the plants that are covering the sky, and then I layered the white again on top for the clouds. Then I used those same bluish greens to create the rest of the landscape in the background, which you can't see as much of because there's a bit of a slope to the grass in the foreground, so a lot of it is being covered. But again, I just mixed the different green tones, and I also layered the dark green on top of a gray sometimes to create a bit more tonal variation. Next, I moved on to the plants that cover some of the sky, so there's a few leaves that are kind of swaying in the wind, as well as two pink sort of flowers, which add a really nice pop of color to the scene. I mainly used this olive green for the leaves, and I made sure to vary the shapes just like in the reference. And then for the flowers, I picked out two bright pink shades, and I used some short strokes to create that sort of feathered look, and also a really rich brown for the stems. Then I just filled in the rest of the grass in the foreground, and again I made that gradient towards the edge of the paper where it gets a bit darker. And then I started by just adding various leaves in different shades of green. I tried to make sure they're not the same color as the background because obviously that makes them a bit hard to see. So I used some darker shades on top of the lighter areas and lighter greens towards the bottom, just like in the reference. I really loved all the different colors in the grass, like this bright yellow on the top and the different turquoise shades for some of the lighter leaves on the bottom, and also the subtle patterns on some of them, like the lighter tips or the dark shapes on the inside of these leaves on the bottom that I'm making. Now, like I mentioned before, everything that was animated also had outlines, so I first went in with my Tombow Fudenosuke calligraphy pen, but I ended up not liking it as much because the ink is a lot more reflective than the acrylic pens, and because it's a really rich black, it was also just a little bit too dark for the sort of dreamy feel that the scene has. But I first just outlined Kiki and the animated plants in the foreground, and I ended up covering everything later on with a lighter, sort of muted grayish brown, which just felt a lot more cohesive. I still really enjoyed doing the line art just because it makes Kiki and the plants pop a lot more, and it also just defines some of the shapes, which makes the whole painting feel a lot more finished. Here I went over the line art again like I mentioned, and since it's a bit harder to make really thin lines, I corrected the line art with the surrounding colors, which ended up being a really straightforward process, but it did take a pretty long time, so that's why I didn't want to include all of the footage again, so I just cut out the majority of it so it doesn't get too boring. And with that, this painting is all finished, so the last step is just to remove the washi tape, and what I found in the past is that pulling it close to the surface of the painting just minimizes the chances of the paper ripping, so I'm just going very slow and steady, and it worked out pretty well, and of course it's always very satisfying. Anyway, that is it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed this cozy painting session. I haven't done this in a long time and I definitely had a lot of fun with it. I also really love trying out the acrylic pens. I will definitely be using them again, so thanks again to Arrtx for letting me try them out and also for sponsoring this video. And then lastly, here are just some close-up shots of the painting. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!